The phone inside room 8 started ringing again at exactly 3:17 a.m. I remember staring at the motel switchboard behind the front desk while desert wind screamed softly across the empty parking lot outside the office windows. Every room at the Red Mesa Motel showed dark except room 8. Its indicator light pulsed slowly across the old analog panel, which was dozens of disconnected lines that hadn't worked properly in years. The problem was simple enough on paper. Room 8 was vacant. Had been vacant for almost 8 months according to the reservation logs. But the extension kept calling the front desk every night before sunrise anyway. Sometimes once. Sometimes dozens of times in a row until the ringing echoed through the office hard enough to make sleep impossible. Walter, the motel owner, warned me about it during orientation. Never answer calls from room 8 after 3 a.m., he told me quietly while avoiding eye contact. And if someone knocks on the office window asking for that room specifically, keep the blinds closed until dawn. Then the phone rang again. Not from the switchboard. From directly behind me. I turned slowly toward the office hallway leading deeper into the motel building while cold pressure settled into my stomach hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable. The ringing was coming from the old storage room at the end of the corridor. A room with no connected phone line anymore. Then the ringing stopped, and a man's voice whispered softly through the darkness behind the hallway door. Front desk. I think you checked the version of me in 3 nights earlier. I took the night manager position at the Red Mesa Motel because I had finally run out of places willing to pretend I was doing okay. My name is Daniel Mercer. 36 years old. Former paramedic from Phoenix. Divorced, half-drunk most nights, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't really fix anymore. 2 years earlier, my younger sister Leah disappeared while driving alone through western Arizona during a desert storm. Her car was eventually found abandoned beside Route 64 with the engine still running and her phone sitting on the passenger seat connected to an active call nobody could explain. The line had remained open for nearly 7 hours after she vanished. No voices. No movement. Just static and distant ringing somewhere far away from the highway patrol dispatcher listening on the other end. After that, normal life started collapsing quietly around me. I stopped showing up consistently at work. Started drinking harder. Relationships became impossible because every conversation eventually circled back toward grief or guilt or unfinished questions nobody could answer. So when I found an ad online offering overnight motel work deep in the Nevada desert with free lodging and cash payment under the table, I accepted before really considering why a roadside motel that isolated would need someone willing to stay awake until sunrise every night. The Red Mesa Motel sat nearly 50 miles from the nearest town along an old desert highway most navigation systems barely acknowledged anymore. The property looked exhausted even during daylight hours. A long single-story building shaped like a crooked horseshoe surrounding an empty swimming pool half-filled with wind-blown sand. Flickering vacancy signs buzzing softly against the pale afternoon heat. Rows of faded motel doors beneath cracked, buzzed walls stained dark by years of dust storms and neglect. Behind the main office stretched endless desert broken only by old telephone poles and distant mountain ridges shimmering beneath heat distortion. But after sunset, the place changed personality completely. Wind moved constantly across the valley carrying static through the broken neon signs while the empty parking lot reflected moonlight in strange uneven patches, like standing water. Some nights, the isolation felt unnatural out there, not because the desert was empty, but because it felt expectant somehow. Like the motel existed beside a road people still traveled long after the world forgot it was there. The owner, Walter Gass, met me during my first evening shift shortly before dusk settled across the valley. Thin older man. Cigarette-stained fingers. tired eyes carrying the specific expression of someone who hasn't slept peacefully in years. He explained the basic responsibilities quickly while chain-smoking beside the front office coffee machine. Check guests in if any travelers stop overnight. Keep the switchboard running. Restock vending machines before dawn. Simple enough. Most nights only attracted truckers or stranded motorists anyway, according to Walter. But eventually the conversation shifted toward the motel rules. Never rent room 8 regardless of customer demand. Never investigate sounds coming from the empty pool after 2 a.m. If the office phones ring 3 times in rapid succession during a storm, disconnect the switchboard until sunrise. I remember laughing quietly because the rules sounded less like motel procedures and more like campfire stories built to scare new employees working isolated shifts. Walter didn't laugh back. He just stared silently through the office blinds toward the darkening motel courtyard outside while wind pushed sand softly across the parking lot. Then he showed me the switchboard. Old analog system mounted beside the reservation desk, connected to every room through faded extension lines. Probably old. Most of the motel phones barely functioned properly anymore, according to Walter. Static drift. Ted constantly across the lines after midnight because the desert storms interfered with the wiring buried beneath the highway. But one extension still worked perfectly. Room 8. The indicator light beside its line glowed faintly red even while the room remained vacant. "You'll probably hear it ringing eventually," Walter said quietly while checking the connections with visibly shaking hands. "Just let it ring." Before I could ask why, he continued speaking without looking at me. "And if someone asks whether Leah already checked in here, tell them you've never heard that name before." My stomach tightened instantly hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable because I had never mentioned my sister to him once since arriving at the motel. That night, after Walter finally drove away from the property beneath the dying sunset, I sat alone inside the office listening to desert wind scrape softly against the motel windows while darkness settled slowly across the valley outside. Around midnight, the first storm rolled over the mountains. Not heavy rain. Just distant thunder and static drifting endlessly through the office radio while lightning flickered silently beyond the highway. Most of the motel remained dark except for the weak yellow lights glowing outside each empty room door. I remember staring toward room 8 across the courtyard while balancing the reservation ledger on the counter because something about the room felt subtly wrong even from a distance. The curtains were closed tightly behind the window. No vehicle parked outside. No movement anywhere along the walkway. Yet every few minutes, the porch light outside the room dimmed slightly like someone inside kept turning another light on and off behind the curtains. Then, sometime around 2:43 a.m., the switchboard beside me crackled softly through waves of static. And the red indicator light for room 8 slowly blinked alive for the first time. At first, the phone calls from room 8 almost convinced me the motel rules were nothing more than paranoid rituals invented by exhausted people spending too many years alone beside forgotten highways. Desert isolation changes people gradually. You start assigning meaning to ordinary noises because silence out there feels too large for the human brain to process comfortably. The first call came at 2:43 a.m., exactly the way Walter predicted. One slow pulse of red light across the switchboard. Then another. Then the soft mechanical ringing drifted through the office beneath the static humming from the old radio near the coffee machine. I remember staring at the extension number for several seconds, waiting for the unease to hit me harder than it actually did. But nothing happened. No supernatural dread. No impossible voices. Just an old motel phone ringing in the middle of the night while desert wind scraped sand against the office windows outside. Eventually the ringing stopped on its own after maybe 30 seconds. The red light went dark again. And for the rest of the shift, The motel returned to ordinary silence beneath distant thunder moving slowly through the valley. Over the next few nights, the calls became part of the routine. Around midnight, I'd clean the office counters and update reservation logs while truckers occasionally stopped for coffee or cheap rooms before continuing west toward California. After 2 a.m., the highway usually emptied completely. No headlights. No engine noise. Just endless desert darkness surrounding the motel, beneath weak neon lights, softly across the parking lot. Then sometime before sunrise, Room 8 would call the front desk again. Sometimes once. Sometimes repeatedly in uneven bursts, like someone inside the vacant room kept hanging up and redialing the office extension. I never answered. Mostly because I didn't see the point. Old wiring does strange things during storms. Crossed signals happen. Static interferes with abandoned phone systems all the time. Rational explanations came easily enough if I stayed tired enough not to think too hard about the details. Still, certain things around the motel slowly started feeling wrong in ways difficult to package logically. Small things at first. Room keys appearing on the counter after I already locked them away. Guest registration cards filled out in handwriting matching are for people who never physically checked in. Once I found fresh cigarette smoke drifting beneath the door of Room 8 despite the room remaining locked for days. The desert itself carried a strange atmosphere before sunrise. Not frightening exactly. Anticipatory. Some nights I'd stand outside the office smoking beside the empty parking lot while lightning flickered silently beyond the mountains and feel something watching the motel from the darkness beyond the highway. Not a person. More like attention itself lingering somewhere out past the floodlights where the desert disappeared into blackness. Around 3 a.m., the static drifting through the office radio always intensified too. Fragments of conversations slipping through empty frequencies. Voices too distorted to understand properly. Once, I could have sworn I heard Leah laughing softly beneath the interference while updating reservation logs behind the counter. Another night, the switchboard briefly activated every room extension at once before shutting itself off again without explanation. But the strangest incidents always involved the guest records. The motel occupancy logs kept changing after midnight. Names appearing on room assignments I never wrote down. Handwriting shifting subtly between entries. Entire check-ins recorded during hours when nobody arrived at the property physically. Shift the truck driver. His name was Howard Pike. According to the license, he slid across the counter during a stormy shift around 1:30 a.m. middle-aged. Exhausted looking. Smelled faintly of diesel fuel and cigarette ash. At first he seemed ordinary enough. Just another long-haul driver trying to survive the night before continuing east through the mountains at sunrise. But while I processed his reservation, he kept glancing nervously toward the motel courtyard outside the office windows like he expected someone standing there beyond the floodlights. Eventually he leaned closer across the counter and asked quietly, "You keeping 8 closed tonight?" My stomach tightened immediately because the question sounded rehearsed somehow. Like travelers passing through the motel already knew the room before arriving there physically. I asked what he meant. Howard stared toward the dark courtyard for several seconds before answering. "Stayed here 6 years ago during a dust storm," he whispered. "Woke up around dawn hearing somebody crying inside the wall beside my room. Sounded like a woman trying to make a phone call." Then he paused. Next morning, the motel manager told me nobody had rented the room in over 20 years. Around 3:11 a.m., Howard started screaming. I found him standing barefoot outside room 12, beneath flickering courtyard lights, while desert wind pushed sand violently across the concrete walkways around the motel. He looked terrified in the specific way people do after waking from anesthesia too quickly. Pale skin. disoriented breathing. Eyes fixed toward room 8 farther down the courtyard. "Someone keeps calling my room," he kept repeating while gripping the railing hard enough that his knuckles looked bloodless beneath the storm lighting. Every time I answer, they already know what I'm about to say. I tried calming him down, assuming exhaustion or sleep paralysis mixed with too much caffeine and highway fatigue. But then the office switchboard behind me crackled loudly through the open doorway. Every extension light activated simultaneously across the panel for roughly 3 seconds before shutting off again. Except room 8. Its red indicator remained glowing steadily beneath the static. Then the office phone rang once, and Howard slowly turned toward me with genuine panic spreading across his face. "That's her," he whispered quietly. "That's the woman from inside the wall." Howard refused to go back inside after the phone call. For nearly 20 minutes, he paced the courtyard beneath the storm while lightning flickered silently beyond the mountains surrounding the motel. I remember standing beside him near the empty swimming pool trying to calm him down while wind pushed sand across the concrete hard enough to sting my face. He kept insisting the voice on the line knew personal things nobody should have known. Childhood memories. His dead wife's name. The exact route he planned to drive after sunrise. At first I assumed he was having some kind of breakdown triggered by exhaustion or stimulant abuse. Long-haul drivers unravel so, me times after enough nights alone on highways. I'd seen worse back when I worked emergency response in Phoenix. But the longer Howard talked, the harder it became ignoring the fear underneath his voice. Not panic. Recognition. Like he already understood something about the motel, I would ignore trying to rationalize away. Then he looked directly toward room 8 beneath the flickering courtyard lights and whispered quietly, "She keeps asking why I never came back for her after the accident." That sentence stayed with me long after Nally locked himself inside the office until sunrise. Because I knew exactly what he meant. Not literally. Emotionally. Grief changes the way people hear unfinished conversations. After Leah disappeared, I spent months replaying our last phone call trying to identify hidden warnings inside ordinary words. Human beings naturally reconstruct the missing parts of trauma until eventually memory becomes interactive. That's what I kept telling myself while cleaning coffee cups behind the counter around 2:50 a.m. the following night. Room 8 wasn't haunted. The motel simply attracted lonely, damaged people crossing isolated highways at the worst hours of the night. The phone calls became psychological mirrors, eventually. People heard what they already carried emotionally before arriving there. Rational enough. Clinical even. But while updating reservation logs beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, I noticed something deeply uncomfortable in the motel registry sitting open beside the switchboard. Leah's name appeared inside room 8's occupancy records. Not recently. Dated 2 years earlier. Check-in time, 3:14 a.m. No checkout recorded. My stomach tightened instantly hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable. I stared at the handwriting for nearly a full minute trying to convince myself exhaustion was distorting what I saw. But the signature looked exactly like hers. Same rourish, uneven loops along the capital letters. Same habit of crossing that ing lowercase t's too high across the stem. Rational explanations collapsed almost immediately after that. Walter couldn't have forged it because he never met Leah. Nobody at the motel even knew her full name except me. Yet there it was inside the registry beside room 8 exactly 3 days after the official date of her disappearance along Route 64. Then the switchboard crackled softly to the rough waves of static beside my arm. And the red extension light for room 8 slowly began blinking again. This time, I answered. I told myself I needed proof. Something concrete enough to finally separate exhaustion from reality. The ringing stopped the moment I lifted the receiver. At first I only heard static drifting softly across the line beneath faint electrical humming somewhere far away. Then came Brea, thing. Slow. Uneven. Female. Every muscle in my body locked instantly because I recognized it before the voice even spoke. Leah had asthma attacks when we were kids. Mild ones mostly. But afterward her breathing always carried this faint strained whistle for several minutes like air struggling through narrow spaces. The exact same sound drifted quietly through the motel phone pressed against my ear while desert wind rattled the office window. Then my sister whispered softly through the static. "Danny, why did you leave me in room 8? The line went dead immediately afterward. Nothing terrible happened right away. No supple manifestation. No impossible shadow appearing outside the office. In fact, for the rest of the shift, the motel almost seemed calmer than usual. The storm outside weakened shortly before dawn while the switchboard remained silent beneath the fluorescent lights. Around sunrise, I even convinced myself the entire phone call had been some kind of grief-induced auditory hallucination triggered by seeing Leah's name inside the guest registry unexpectedly. Human memory is dangerously suggestible under stress. That explanation almost held together until I started closing the office for the morning and noticed the reservation ledger sitting open exactly where I left it earlier. Except that the entry beside Leah's name had changed. The original check-in date is gone completely now. Replaced by a new note written carefully beneath room 8's assignment in handwriting I immediately recognized as my own. She called again at 3:17 a.m. "And this time you answered." After I answered the call from room 8, the motel stopped behaving like a physical place in ways subtle enough to make me question my own memory before anything openly impossible happened. At first, the changes felt small. The hallway clocks drift out of sync by several minutes every night after 3 a.m. guest vehicles appear in different parking spaces than where I remembered seeing them earlier. Reservation records updated themselves while I stood physically beside the ledger, watching blank pages slowly fill with names and room numbers in handwriting matching people currently asleep inside the motel. Most disturbing of all, the office phones no longer rang randomly. They rang predictively. Some nights, the switchboard activated several seconds before guests physically picked up their room receivers. Other times, I'd hear conversations through disconnected lines moments before travelers entered the office, asking the exact questions I had already listened to over static. The motel itself no longer felt reactive. It felt anticipatory somehow. Like the building already understood events before they finished happening inside it. The radio static intensified too. Every storm rolling across the valley after midnight carried voices through the motel speakers now. At first, they sounded fragmented beyond recognition. Half-finished sentences buried beneath electrical interference and desert wind. But gradually the transmissions became personal in ways impossible to ignore rationally. Leah asked whether I finally checked the right room this time. My ex-wife is repeating arguments we had during the months after my sister disappeared. Once, I heard my own voice calmly describing movements around the motel several seconds before I physically performed them. "He's opening the courtyard door now," the static whispered while I stood behind the office counter. The end without consciously deciding to, I found myself reaching for the exact door handle moments later. The worst part wasn't hearing familiar voices through the static. It was the growing sensation that the motel already knew which memories would hurt most before I consciously remembered them myself. Then the guests started recognizing people who weren't there. A retired couple passing through Nevada claimed they heard children running around the empty pool after midnight despite the courtyard remaining vacant on the security cameras. One truck driver swore a woman matching Leah's description knocked repeatedly on his motel window, asking to use the room phone around 3 a.m. Another guest checked out before dawn, insisting somebody kept walking slowly back and forth outside his door all night, whispering room numbers beneath the storm. But nobody ever physically appeared on the surveillance feeds afterward. That's what made the fear inside the motel feel so unstable. The experiences weren't consistent. Everyone seemed to encounter different people depending on what emotional weight they carried into the building. Yet every story eventually circled back toward room 8 somehow. Like the room itself functioned less like a location and more like a pressure point where unfinished recognition surfaced through the motel after enough isolation and exhaustion blurred together. 3 nights after I answered Leah's call, the maintenance logs began changing. G2. The motel kept old repair records stored inside filing cabinets behind the office desk, dating back nearly 40 years. Most documented ordinary desert damage, electrical failures during storms, plumbing repairs, structural cracks spreading through the empty pool after heat waves. But after midnight, certain pages started rewriting themselves gradually while I watched. Entire work orders appear in fresh ink across old paper. Room 8 is mentioned constantly. Emergency line repairs. Wall removals. Reports of voices coming through disconnected wiring beneath the motel. One entry dated 14 years earlier described a maintenance worker discovering dozens of old phone lines buried behind the walls surrounding Room 8, despite the building blueprints showing no active connections there originally. Another note described guests hearing ringing inside empty rooms after storms passed through the valley. Then I found the final report buried near the back of the cabinet. Motel incident, August 2003. Female guest missing after overnight electrical outage. Last confirmed location, Room 8. The attached signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Walter Grady. That night, the storm arrived harder than any before it. Heavy desert rain hammered the motel roof while thunder rolled continuously across the valley hard enough to shake the office windows beneath waves of static pouring through the switchboard. Around 3:16 a.m., every phone inside the motel activated simultaneously. Room extensions rang one after another beneath the storm while red indicator lights flashed violently across the analog panel behind the desk. Then the lights cut out completely. Total darkness swallowed the office except for the lightning flickering through the blinds facing the courtyard outside. For several seconds, all I could hear was ringing. Dozens of motel phones were echoing through the building beneath the rain. Then the emergency generator kicked on with a deep mechanical groan. Weak red backup lights flooded the courtyard beyond the office windows. And standing directly outside Room 8, beneath the store, was Leah. Same denim jacket she wore the night she disappeared. Same tired expression from the last photograph on her driver's license. Rainwater ran down her face while she held the motel receiver against one ear, staring directly toward the office through the darkness. Then the switchboard beside me crackled softly through static. And every extension light on the panel went dark except Room 8. Its red indicator glowed steadily while my sister slowly raised one hand toward the office window outside and mouthed 6 words I somehow heard clearly over the storm without the phone line connecting at all. "You checked the wrong person in, Danny." Seeing Leah standing outside Room 8 shattered the last stable explanation I still carried for the motel. Up until then, I could still force parts of what was happening into categories that sounded medically plausible. Sleep deprivation. Desert isolation. Trauma projects self onto unstable environments. But grief doesn't stand beneath storm lights holding motel receivers while speaking sentences nobody else should know. The moment the courtyard lights came back online after the blackout, Leah was gone from outside Room 8 completely. No footprints in the rain. No movement across the parking lot. Just empty concrete reflecting red emergency lights beneath the storm while the switchboard continued glowing softly behind the office counter. I remember locking every office door manually after that while thunder rolled through the valley and trying unsuccessfully to steady my breathing long enough to think clearly. Then I noticed something strange sitting beside the reservation ledger where the motel keys were normally kept. A cassette tape. Black plastic. Water-damaged label. Written across the front in faded marker. If room 8 calls you back, listen first. The tape belonged to Walter. I found the old cassette player buried beneath maintenance manuals inside the office storage closet shortly before dawn while rain hammered the motel roof overhead. At first the recording only contained static drifting softly beneath the mechanical hiss of old tape reels turning. Then Walter's voice emerged quietly through the interference, sounding years younger and far more frightened than the exhausted man who hired me. "If you're hearing this," he whispered, "then the room already recognized you emotionally." My stomach tightened instantly because the sentence felt less like a warning and more like a diagnosis. According to Walter's recording, the Red Mesa Motel wasn't originally built as a motel at all. During the 1960s, the property operated briefly as an emergency communications relay for highway patrol and desert rescue services during storms crossing the Nevada routes. Dozens of phone lines ran beneath the building connected to remote call stations scattered across abandoned highways throughout the valley. Then came the accident in August 2003. A flash flood stranded several travelers inside the motel during a severe electrical outage while emergency dispatch systems malfunctioned across the region. One woman vanished during the storm after repeatedly trying to contact someone through room 8's disconnected phone line. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. My mother. I stopped breathing for several seconds after hearing that. Not because the name sounded similar. Exact. Walter continued speaking softly through the tape while thunder echoed faintly beneath the recording static. According to the incident report, Evelyn Mercer checked into the motel alone during a desert storm roughly 6 months before Leah was born. She spent most of the night attempting to place long-distance calls from room 8 after receiving news about a fatal highway collision involving her husband, my father. But emergency operators later claimed the calls were routed strangely through disconnected relay systems buried beneath the motel instead of reaching ordinary phone lines. Witnesses reported hearing Evelyn speaking to people who weren't physically present inside the room. Some heard her arguing with another version of herself through the walls. Others claimed the motel switchboard kept receiving incoming calls from room 8 several minutes before Evelyn physically lifted the receiver. Then, sometime before sunrise during the storm blackout, she disappeared completely. No forced exit. No vehicle is missing from the lot. Just an open motel room, a phone still off the hook, and static pouring endlessly through the disconnected line until emergency crews physically cut the wiring beneath the building. Then the tape changed. Walter's voice stopped mid-sentence like the recording itself lost sequence briefly. For several seconds, only static drifted softly through the speakers. Then Leah started talking. Not a recording. Current. "Danny," she whispered through the tape. "You still think I disappeared on the highway because of the storm?" Every muscle in my body locked instantly while the cassette continued playing beneath the office lights around me. Her breathing sounded strained again, the same way it had over the motel phone nights earlier. "I checked into the motel after the accident," she continued softly. "That's why the room recognized you. I nearly destroyed the tape player right there out of pure panic." Rational thought completely collapsed beneath the sound of her voice speaking through a cassette Walter recorded years before my sister vanished. But then she said something that froze me harder than anything else since arriving at Red Mesa. "The motel doesn't keep dead people here," she whispered carefully. "It keeps unfinished arrivals." That night, I searched room 8 for the first time. The door unlocked too easily. Inside, the room smelled faintly of dust, rainwater, and old cigarette smoke trapped beneath years of sealed air. Nothing looked obviously wrong at first glance. Standard motel furniture beneath weak yellow lights. Torn curtains hanging beside the window facing the courtyard. A disconnected rotary phone resting on the bedside table with its line physically cut near the wall outlet decades earlier. But the deeper I moved into the room, the stranger the atmosphere became. The air felt subtly delayed somehow, as sound itself traveled more slowly inside room 8 than the rest of the motel. Then I noticed the wallpaper behind the bed shifting slightly beneath the storm outside. Not moving. Breathing almost imperceptibly around hidden shapes beneath the plaster. I peeled part of it back carefully near the floor and discovered dozens of old phone wires buried inside the walls running far deeper than the motel blueprints should have allowed. Some looked ancient. Others appeared newer somehow despite being covered in dust. And wrapped tightly around the deepest bundle of wires hidden inside the wall cavity was Leah's silver necklace from the night she disappeared beside a motel key tagged room 8. Finding Leah's necklace inside the wall behind room 8 changed the motel from something frightening into something personal in a way that escaped stop feeling possible. Up until then, I still carried this desperate belief that I could eventually leave Red Mesa behind if things became dangerous enough. Quit the job. Drive east until the desert disappears behind me. Pretend the phone calls and shifting guest records were symptoms of grief amplified by isolation. But standing there inside room 8, holding the tarnished silver necklace my sister wore the night she vanished, destroyed that illusion completely. The motel already knew too much about me. Worse, it understood the emotional architecture underneath my grief more intimately than I did myself. That realization settled into my chest with a strange numbness rather than panic. Like some exhausted part of me had finally stopped resisting what the place actually was. Because Leah had been right. The motel didn't preserve dead people. It preserved unfinished arrivals. Emotional states were trapped somewhere between recognition and acceptance until eventually the building stopped distinguishing memory from occupancy entirely. I stopped sleeping in the employee room behind the office after that night. Instead, I stayed awake until sunrise every shift, sitting beside the switchboard with Walter's cassette tapes spread across the reservation desk like evidence from a crime scene nobody properly survived. The more recordings I listened to, the clearer the pattern became. Every employee who stayed at Red Mesa long enough eventually started developing personal rules separate from Walter's original instructions. One former manager avoided mirrors after 3 a.m. because reflections inside the motel supposedly reacted to arriving guests before they physically checked in. Another refused to walk the second-floor balcony during storms after hearing motel room phones ringing beneath the concrete walls where no wiring existed anymore. Claire Bennett, a night clerk who disappeared sometime during the late 1990s, documented entire notebooks describing how certain guests appeared repeatedly across decades without aging, while reservation logs rewrote themselves nightly around unresolved emotional trauma. Yet all of them eventually arrived at the same conclusion, hidden beneath different languages. The motel didn't create hauntings. It reorganized recognition. So I created my own rules. Never enter room 8 alone during storms. Never answer any phone call using Leah's voice, regardless of what she says. Never trust reservation records written after 3 a.m. Most importantly, never allow yourself to emotionally confirm someone in the motel who is still reconstructing. For a while, the building actually seemed calmer afterward. Fewer phone calls from disconnected extensions. Fewer guests are reporting voices through the walls or footsteps around the empty pool. Some nights, the motel almost felt ordinary again beneath the buzzing neon lights and endless desert wind surrounding the property. But the deeper problem wasn't the paranormal activity anymore. It was the motel itself gradually changing around me in ways harder to explain logically. Hallways stretched subtly longer during storms. Room numbers shifted positions between glances. Sometimes the office bathroom appeared at the opposite end of the corridor from where I remembered leaving it earlier. And every night after 3 a.m., the switchboard began activating extensions before guests physically checked into those rooms afterward. Then the motel started anticipating my thoughts. The first time happened while updating reservation logs during a thunderstorm around 2:57 a.m. I remember thinking briefly about Leah's necklace hidden beneath the office counter and whether I should destroy it somehow before the motel used it again. Immediately afterward, Room 8's extension light activated across the switchboard without ringing, just glowing steadily red beneath the static. Then the disconnected office printer beside the reservation desk slowly printed a single sentence across blank motel receipt paper. "She doesn't want you to throw it away." I stared at the message for nearly a full minute while thunder rolled across the valley outside. No logical explanation held together anymore after that. The printer wasn't connected to the switchboard systems. Hell, half the office electronics barely functioned properly even during daylight hours. Yet the motel responded directly to thoughts I never physically verbalized aloud. Worse, the response carried emotional familiarity beneath it. Not threatening. Intimate. Like the building already understood my grief deeply enough to predict which choices I would make before consciously deciding them myself. 3 nights later, I found Walter's final journal hidden inside the ceiling above the switchboard room. The handwriting looked unstable compared to earlier records, smeared across pages like someone documenting thoughts faster than ordinary memory could process them linearly anymore. "The motel isn't haunted," one sentence read repeatedly throughout the notebook. "It's unfinished communication." Another line appeared hard enough to tear through the paper beneath it. "Recognition creates occupancy." According to Walter's final entries, the old emergency relay buried beneath Red Mesa somehow collapsed emotional distress calls into physical space during storms after decades of repeated signal interference across the desert highways. Every desperate phone call routed through the motel during moments of fear, grief, guilt, or regret left residual emotional patterns inside the building. Over time, the motel gradually learned how to reconstruct those unresolved identities through recognition by isolated guests and workers emotionally vulnerable enough to respond to them. I barely finished reading the last page before every motel phone activated simultaneously beneath the storm outside. Dozens of extensions rang one after another through the darkened hallways around the courtyard. Then the switchboard crackled softly through waves of static. And Leah whispered through every connected line in the building at once. "Danny, someone checked into the wrong room again." The moment Leah's voice echoed through every motel phone simultaneously, the entire building seemed to exhale around me. Not metaphorically. Physically. The walls inside the office creaked softly beneath the storm while static poured endlessly through the switchboard speakers hard enough to distort the fluorescent lights overhead. Outside, rain hammered the empty courtyard surrounding the motel beneath violent desert wind while every room extension pulsed red across the analog panel beside the reservation desk. I remember standing there gripping Walter's journal so tightly the paper bent in my hands while dozens of motel phones rang out of sequence through the hallways beyond the office. Some stopped abruptly before others physically started. A few continued ringing even after their extension lights went dark. Then the office radio crackled softly beneath the overlapping noise. "Daniel," Leah whispered calmly through the static. "The motel already checked you in years ago." Then the guest registry opened by itself. Pages flipped violently beneath the office lights while wind screamed against the windows outside. Room assignments blurred past faster than I could read them. Names appearing, disappearing, rewriting themselves across decades of reservation records simultaneously. Travelers who vanished along highways. Motel employees. Guests are listed as both checked in and checked out at the same time. Then the pages stopped turning abruptly near the center of the ledger. My stomach tightened instantly because I recognized the handwriting covering the open reservation page before consciously reading the name itself.
Mine.
Dozens of entries written across different years in slightly different handwriting variations, all assigning me repeatedly to room 8. Some dated months into the future. Other decades earlier, before the motel technically even opened, according to the property records. Then the office phone rang directly beside my hand. Extension 8. I answered without thinking. At first, I only heard heavy breathing through the line beneath waves of static and distant ringing somewhere far away inside the motel walls. Then came my own voice speaking softly through the interference. "You still think Leah disappeared after arriving here?" it whispered calmly. Every muscle in my body locked instantly because the voice sounded exhausted in ways I recognized intimately. Not imitation. Familiarity. Like hearing recordings of yourself during periods you barely remember surviving emotionally. "That's why the motel keeps rebuilding the call," the voice continued quietly. "You never accepted which room she actually checked into." Then the line filled suddenly with overlapping conversations bleeding through each other beneath the static. Motel guests are crying. Emergency dispatch operators are repeating unanswered calls. Walter begs someone not to open room 8 during the storm. And somewhere beneath all of it, Leah was screaming my name through endless phone ringing before the connection abruptly cut dead. That's when the motel layout started changing completely. The hallway outside the office stretched impossibly far beneath flickering emergency lights, while room numbers shifted positions across the courtyard walls between lightning flashes outside. Room 12 became room 5. The ice machine appeared where the vending machines should have been moments earlier. Even the empty swimming pool looked deeper somehow beneath the rain, like dark water moved slowly beneath the layers of sand filling it. Worst of all, the guests started arriving without vehicles. One by one, motel room doors opened across the courtyard, revealing silent travelers already standing inside beneath weak yellow lights. Some wore outdated clothing from different decades. Others looked wet from storms that weren't physically happening anymore. Every single one watched the office calmly through the rain without speaking. And standing nearest room 8 beneath the flickering porch light was Leah wearing the same denim jacket from the night she vanished. Except this time, when she slowly raised her head toward me across the courtyard, she was using my face instead of hers. Then Walter appeared inside the office hallway behind me. Or something reconstructing Walter did. Same cigarette-stained jacket. Same exhausted posture. But his movements felt subtly delayed beneath the emergency lights, like the motel kept correcting details about him after he physically moved. "The room doesn't trap people," he whispered while staring toward the courtyard outside. "It finishes unresolved arrivals." For several seconds, different faces shifted slowly beneath his expression during the flickering lights overhead. Leah.
Me.
Guests from the registry. All surfacing briefly beneath Walter's skin before dissolving again like unstable reflections struggling to settle into one identity permanently. Then he looked directly at me with genuine pity spreading across his face. "You still think your sister called for help from the highway that night," he whispered. "But the call came from inside the motel after you already left her here." The moment he said that, every phone inside Red Mesa stopped ringing simultaneously. Total silence swallowed the building except for thunder rolling across the valley outside. Then, somewhere deep inside the motel walls surrounding room 8, another phone started ringing softly beneath the plaster. Slow, rhythmic, patient. And all around the courtyard beyond the office windows, the silent guests slowly turned their heads toward the sound at the same moment. For several seconds, Nobody moved. The silent guests standing throughout the courtyard remained perfectly still beneath the storm, while the ringing inside the motel walls echoed softly through the building around us. Rainwater streamed down the cracked concrete walkway, reflecting distorted yellow porch lights across the empty pool, while thunder rolled endlessly beyond the mountains surrounding Red Mesa. Walter, or whatever unstable version of him the motel reconstructed, stood motionless inside the office hallway, watching me with exhausted pity spreading beneath shifting faces that never fully settled into one identity anymore. Then Leah slowly stepped forward outside room 8, using my body perfectly beneath the storm. Same height. Same scar across the chin from a childhood bicycle accident. Same tired posture I saw every morning in mirrors after too little sleep. "You keep remembering the wrong disappearance," she whispered across the courtyard without physically raising her voice. Somehow, I heard every word clearly through the rain anyway. That was the moment I finally understood what the motel actually preserved. Not ghosts. Not memories. Arrivals. The old relay buried beneath Red Mesa never trapped dead people inside disconnected phone lines. It preserved unresolved emotional communication at the exact moment people failed to reach each other during trauma. Emergency calls. Last conversations. Unanswered warnings. The motel gradually learned how to reconstruct those unfinished emotional states through recognition by isolated travelers emotionally vulnerable enough to respond to them. Leah didn't disappear after checking into Red Mesa. She disappeared because she checked into Red Mesa. The motel intercepted her distress call during the storm and repeatedly rebuilt her arrival through every person emotionally connected to losing her afterward. That's why the voices knew intimate details before speaking them aloud. Why the switchboard anticipated conversations before they physically happened. The building wasn't haunting people. It was continuously attempting to complete unfinished emotional communication by reorganizing identity around unresolved arrivals until eventually nobody remembered which version originally left the motel alive. Then I remembered something buried beneath years of guilt hard enough to make my stomach twist painfully. The night Leah disappeared, she called me 3 times before midnight. I never answered. We had argued earlier that week about money and our mother's medical bills and the fact that I kept drinking instead of helping anyone emotionally after Dad died. By the time that her final call arrived during the storm, I muted the phone and fell asleep drunk on my apartment couch without listening to the voicemail. The next morning, Highway Patrol informed me her abandoned car was found along Route 64 with an active emergency line still connected. For 2 years, I blamed myself for not answering before the accident happened. But standing there inside the office while the motel walls rang softly around room 8, another possibility settled into place slowly enough to feel physically nauseating. What if Leah never reached the highway after the call at all? What if she arrived at Red Mesa during the storm emotionally unfinished already, and the motel simply preserved the last unanswered conversation indefinitely afterward? The ringing inside the walls grew louder. Not mechanically. Desperately. Every silent guest throughout the courtyard slowly turned toward room 8 beneath the storm while the motel lights dimmed unevenly across the property. The building itself felt unstable now, like reality around Red Mesa was struggling to maintain proper sequence beneath the emotional pressure accumulating through the relay systems buried underneath it. Hallways stretched farther between lightning flashes. Room doors changed numbers whenever I looked away too quickly. Reflections inside the office windows showed guests arriving through storms that hadn't physically happened yet. Then Leah, still wearing my face, looked directly at me across the courtyard. "You can still answer the call correctly," she whispered. "But only one version of us gets to leave after the conversation finishes." That's when I noticed the old emergency relay panel beneath the switchboard desk. According to Walter's journals, The original communication systems beneath Red Mesa routed emergency highway calls manually during storms before satellite dispatch replaced the network decades earlier. Most of the buried relay lines were disconnected after the 2003 incident. Except one. The line connected directly beneath Room 8 remained physically active because nobody ever located where it terminated underground. I understood the pattern immediately. The motel depended on unresolved emotional repetition to maintain the arrivals it reconstructed through recognition. If the communication finally completed properly, honestly, the motel would lose the unfinished identity sustaining the reconstruction cycle around Leah's disappearance. My hand shook badly while pulling open the relay compartment beneath the desk because part of me already understood what the system demanded emotionally before I consciously accepted it. I picked up the emergency relay receiver. Instantly, the entire motel went silent. No thunder. No ringing. No wind is moving across the courtyard. Just breathing, drifting softly through the line beneath waves of distant static. Then Leah spoke quietly through the receiver exactly the way she sounded before panic entered her voice during bad situations. Calm first. Trying not to scare me. Danny, she whispered. I didn't call because I was lost. My chest tightened painfully hard enough to make breathing difficult while the silent guests throughout the courtyard watched the office motionlessly beneath the storm. I called because I didn't want to disappear alone, she continued softly. And you never answered. Tears blurred my vision almost immediately after hearing that because grief had spent years convincing me the worst part of losing Leah was the accident itself. But the motel understood the truth more intimately than I ever allowed myself to. The real horror was the unfinished conversation. Then Leah whispered one final sentence through the receiver beneath the static. You still can. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The receiver trembled in my hand while the entire motel stood frozen around me beneath the storm. Every silent guest remained motionless across the courtyard watching the office through rain-streaked windows. Leah, still wearing my face outside, Room 8, stared toward me with an expression carrying years of exhaustion deeper than grief itself. And somewhere beneath the building, hidden inside the old emergency relay systems buried beneath Red Mesa, the unfinished phone lines hummed softly like distant breathing through the walls. I realized then that the motel had never been trying to trap people maliciously. It was trying to complete conversations. That was the horror underneath all of it. Human beings leave emotional communications unfinished constantly. Arguments unresolved. Apologies never spoken. Final calls ignored because we assume there will always be another chance afterward. Red Mesa Sinclair why preserved those moments until recognition itself became physical occupancy. And standing there with the receiver pressed against my ear, I finally understood what the motel wanted from me. Not sacrifice. Acknowledgement. I'm sorry I didn't answer, I whispered into the line. The moment the words left my mouth, every light inside the motel flickered violently. Not from electrical failure. Release. Outside, the silent guests throughout the courtyard began dissolving gradually beneath the storm like reflections fading from dark glass after sunrise. Some vanished instantly. Others lingered for several seconds longer while rain passed harmlessly through bodies no longer held together by unfinished recognition. Leah stepped slowly forward from beside Room 8, still wearing my face while the motel around us groaned softly beneath shifting walls and collapsing hallway lights. Then her appearance finally stabilized for the first time since arriving at Red Mesa. My face disappeared. So did the motel's unstable reconstruction around her. What remained was simply Leah standing alone beneath the storm wearing the denim jacket from the night she vanished. Same tired eyes. The same expression she carried whenever she tried pretending she wasn't hurt emotionally by something. You weren't supposed to stay guilty forever, she whispered across the courtyard. Then the motel started collapsing inward. Not physically at first. Spatially. Hallways shortening abruptly beneath flickering lights. Room numbers returning to normal positions along the courtyard. The impossible depth surrounding the Amer proprietary pool shrinking back into ordinary cracked concrete filled with rainwater and sand. Even the shrinks changed somehow. The static humming through the building disappeared gradually until only ordinary thunder remained beyond the valley. Inside the office, the switchboard lights blinked violently one final time before every extension went dark except room 8. Its red indicator glowed softly beneath the dim fluorescent lights while the relay receiver in my hand filled with steady empty silence for the first time since I arrived at Red Mesa. Then Leah smiled faintly through the rain outside. Not haunting. Human. And before I could speak again, the courtyard lights flickered once beneath the storm. When they stabilized, she was gone. I woke up 2 days later inside a hospital outside Reno with severe dehydration, exhaustion, and smoke inhalation from an electrical fire that partially destroyed the motel office during the storm. According to the sheriff's report, the Red Mesa Motel had been abandoned for nearly 6 years before I arrived there. No active business license. No functioning utilities except emergency backup power connected illegally through old highway relay systems beneath the property. Walter Grady officially disappeared sometime in 2018 after local authorities attempted shutting the motel down permanently following multiple reports of missing travelers and to shut down dispatch interference during storms. They found no employment records for me either. No payroll forms. No lease agreement. Nothing proving I had legally worked there at all. The strangest detail came from the maintenance crews inspecting the damaged property afterward. Beneath room 8, buried behind collapsed relay panels and disconnected phone lines, they discovered dozens of old emergency recordings routed through the motel dating back decades. Thousands of unfinished calls preserved across dead communication systems long after the original callers vanished. I left Nevada after that and never returned to the desert highways again. For a while, I convinced myself finally answering Leah's call ended whatever existed beneath Red Mesa permanently. Trauma eventually becomes easier to pack than aging itself into manageable explanations once enough distance exists between you and the place where it happened. But certain things refuse fitting into rational categories afterward. About 7 months later, I received an envelope with no return address containing only a motel key tagged room 8 and a printed transcript from an emergency dispatch recording dated the night Leah disappeared. According to the transcript, her final call connected successfully for exactly 11 seconds before the line failed during the storm. Most of the audio remained buried beneath static. Except for one sentence the restoration technicians somehow isolated clearly from the recording. My own voice answered sleepily through the phone, one before the connection ended. Hello. I bape now. Most nights I wake around 3:17 a.m. convinced distant motel phones are ringing somewhere nearby even inside completely silent apartments. Sometimes disconnected hot, L-room phones begin crackling softly with static when I pass them in empty hallways during storms. Other nights I catch reflections in dark motel windows showing occupied rooms behind curtains I know are physically vacant. But the worst moments happen while traveling alone. Cheap roadside motels especially. That's when familiar layouts start feeling subtly incorrect around me. Hallways stretching farther than they should. Vacancy signs flicker, in patterns that resemble Morse code. And every once in a while, usually just before dawn during heavy rain, the room phone beside my bed will ring softly exactly once before stopping. No extension number. No caller ID. Just silence waiting patiently on the other side of the line like something unfinished, still hoping I'll answer correctly this time. And during those moments, I always remember the final sentence written across wall, Grady's last journal entry hidden beneath the red Mesa switchboard. The motel never trapped the dead. It trapped the conversations people were too afraid to finish.